Now, as a student, it's common for you if you're attending a lecture in class, which is quite boring, to get distracted, to doze off, to zone out. Most students will open up their registers and will start drawing or coloring into their books, which is what we call doodling. And if a teacher catches you doodling in class, they may think of it as a sign of you not paying attention. However, interestingly, doodling may actually, if anything, enhance your concentration during a boring task. So, by that I mean, if you are attending a boring lecture in class and you're doodling, you're sketching, you're drawing some shapes during that lecture, it may actually help you concentrate better and remember details better of the lecture. And that is essentially what this study is about. This is the third study of the cognitive approach. It is by Andrade. It is on doodling. And like I said, in this study, Andrade wants to see the impact that doodling may have in enhancing one's concentration and memory, especially during a boring task. So, yes, there are certain things that people do when they get bored that diverts their attention from the main task or the primary task, which in this case is studying, such as using their phones, talking to their friends, etc. Doodling, however, is one behavior which you would assume is something that is taking your attention away from the primary task. But when we do this study, you will see that that may not necessarily be the case. So before we get into the study, let's look at the background. Andrade defines doodling as the sketching of patterns and figures that are unrelated to a primary task. Now, the working memory model basically states that there are two types of memory, working memory, which is visual and auditory, which is basically, in very simple terms, memory of things that you see and what you hear. Now, in this study, the participants will be listening to a pre-recorded voice message, which will be the auditory task. And while doing so, they will be required to doodle, which will be the visual task. And we simply want to see how this doodling may or may not enhance their concentration during this boring task while listening to this really boring pre-recorded lecture. So the psychology being investigated are the concepts or the terms of working memory model, which, like I said, states that there are two types of memory, visual and auditory. Daydreaming is another term we should know. Now, daydreaming is one of those behaviors that students can also show, which in fact will not enhance concentration, but if anything, diverts your attention away from the main task. And this is defined as a state of consciousness where an individual appears to be lost in thoughts. Now, daydreaming is something we're all familiar with. Um, we're sitting in class or just at our homes and just staring into space, not really thinking about anything, just appear to be lost in thoughts. And our attention is not on any particular task. However, if all our attention is focused on one main primary task, that is referred to as focused attention. And it is possible for our concentration or for our attention to be divided among two or more tasks, which is called divided attention. For example, you are driving a car, so your attention is on the road, but at the same time, the radio is on and you're listening to the songs on the radio. So your attention is divided among two tasks. It's a very easy, simple aim to remember. We want to see if doodling will help people concentrate better and remember things better while doing a boring task. So to investigate if, or to test if doodling aids concentration and memory during a boring task. And this will be tested in a controlled and artificial setting of a lab. So it's a lab experiment. We have the IV of the doodling group and the control group, and participants will be randomly allocated to one of the two conditions. So it's an independent measures design. So we have two different groups, and the doodling group will be the group that will be required to doodle during the task, whereas the control group will be the group that will not be required to doodle during the same task. And the doodling will actually be operationalized by sheets of paper that will be provided to the participants. And the dependent variable that we want to test is the concentration and the memory of the participants. This will be measured through two tasks, which will be called the monitoring task and the recall task. It's not a very large sample, only 40 participants, majority of whom are female, only 5 males, so that's a point we should remember for generalizability. They're all part of a participant panel at the UK's Medical Research Council for cognitive research. It is a relatively diverse age range of 18 to 55 years. Now, keep in mind, just something I've noticed, students tend to confuse the sample of the Milgram study with this study. For those of you who've done the Milgram study in the social approach, that too has 40 participants with a very similar age range of 20 to 50 years. So keep in mind that you don't confuse the two. Okay, so this is 35 females, 5 males, age 18 to 55. Now, interestingly, these participants did not volunteer for Andrade's study. The lab where this research is going to be conducted, the participants happen to already be readily available at that institute, at that lab. So, because they're part of a participant pool, they've actually been recruited for another study, which they volunteered for. So, they're at the lab because they're taking part in another study. And as soon as that study is over, they're planning on leaving, going back home. But Andrade quickly approaches them and asks them to take part in her study, and that she would give them a small reward or payment for their participation. So, for that reason, we don't refer to this as a volunteer sample, but instead an opportunity sample, because of the fact that they're already available and they had volunteered for another study that had just been completed. And if anything, that helps with the validity of the study because we want the participants to be bored because we want to see how doodling enhances their concentration while they are bored. So the fact that they've just completed another study suggests that they are probably already really tired. So that will actually help us with our study. Now, some of the tools being used in the study will be a mock telephone call. So like I said earlier, there is going to be a pre-recorded message. It'll be in the form of a pre-recorded telephone call, which the participants will have to listen to. And they're completely aware that this is a pre-recorded call. And they're going to be given certain instructions about this call. A few details about this call are that it's 2.5 minutes long. It's played at a very comfortable volume, so it's quite audible, easy for the participants to hear and understand what is being said. It's played at 227 words per minute. This is something we should remember. And the speaker in the call is a female who is talking about her sister's birthday party. And she will take names of people who are invited to the party. And she'll mention people who are probably or definitely attending the birthday party, as well as a few names of people who are invited but not attending the party. Along with this call will also mention 8 places, cities, or towns in the UK. So all of this information that is going to be said in this 2.5 minute pre-recorded mock telephone call is important because the participants will be tested in terms of concentration and memory on these little details. Along with this mock telephone call that the participants have to listen to, they're also going to be provided with sheets of paper. So as I said earlier, the doodling group and the control group, they will be given sheets of paper. The doodling group will be given an A4 size sheet of paper. An A4 size is basically a regular printer paper size. Both groups are actually going to be given an A4 size piece of paper. So each participant has a separate sheet of paper. The doodling group participants will have a margin on the left side of their paper. It's 4.5 centimeters wide. And that margin is there for them to write down some key or target information while listening to the pre-recorded call. So obviously we're going to talk about this in detail as we get into the procedure. On the right side of that same sheet, there are going to be alternating rows of 10 squares and then 10 circles. So squares, then circles, then squares, and circles, 10 each. And The purpose of these shapes in the sheet is for the participants to shade into. So the doodling over here is not going to be free doodling. So many of you who have probably doodled in classes, classrooms, you tend to do free doodling. You just draw whatever you want. You might draw cartoon characters or patterns or whatever you wish. Over here, the doodling is not free. It's actually going to be done by shading into these squares and these circles that are provided, these shapes that are provided in the sheet. So that is something we have to remember as well. The control group participants are given an A4 size sheet of paper, but it's a lined paper. So lines, regular paper that we see in our registers that we use to take down notes. And there will be no shapes in the sheets of the control participants. So the control participants are not going to be urged to doodle in any way whatsoever. Let's get into the procedure. So the 40 participants are going to randomly be allocated to one of the two groups. Okay, so 20 in the control and 20 in the doodling group. And this is a complete random allocation. Once the participants are split into two groups, all of them, and keep in mind, they don't know that they're in different groups. So that's being done to avoid demand characteristics because they're not entirely aware of the true purpose of this study. So there is slight deception, which we'll get into. But the participants are going to be given a set of instructions which are important for you to remember. There has been a 4-mark question that has been asked on the instructions that the participants were given before beginning the mock telephone call task. And these instructions are, so they're actually going to be placed in a visually dull room. So the room that they're in is going to be actually looking very boring. So we're just trying to enhance their boredom as much as we can. While sitting in this dull room, they have to listen to a mock telephone call. So they know it's pre-recorded, they know it's a fake call, so there is no interaction happening with the speaker because it's already been recorded. The instructions that are given to them are, listen to this mock telephone call and pretend that the speaker is a friend who is inviting you to a birthday party. Then the participants are going to be told by the researcher that it is a rather boring call, but that is okay because you're not required to remember any of it. Now, this is the part where there is slight deception because we don't want the participants to suspect that we will take a memory task because what that would do is it would lead to demand characteristics. Participants would make a conscious effort to try and remember some of the details of the call because later on we will be testing them on their memory. Because like we said, we want to see if doodling will help you concentrate and remember information during a boring task. So to try and avoid demand characteristics, participants are being told that they're not required to remember anything. What they are being told, however, is, let's move on to the next slide. What they are being told is that the speaker is going to be inviting other people as well. So the sheets of paper that have been provided to you, on those papers, you need to write down the names of the people who are definitely or probably attending the party. Do not write anything else. Okay, so this is when the sheets are given to them, and 20 participants will be given the sheet with the shapes, 20 will be given the sheets without the shapes. So automatically you will be in the doodling or the control group. And while listening to this call, the participants are simply going to try and note down the names of the people that they hear the speaker say is definitely or probably attending. And like I said, they're not required to write down anything else. Now, the doodling group participants are given one more specific set of instructions, which is, it's not really an instruction, but they're given a pencil and they're told that the shapes on the sheets are there for them to shade into in case they get bored. So we are not specifically telling them to doodle because that would obviously be suspicious. So instead, we're just saying that they're there in case you get bored. So that is kind of a way to get them to doodle. And if your question is, what if participants don't doodle, even because we're not specifically telling them to, we're saying that they can. So what if there's a chance that someone doesn't doodle? 19 out of the 20 participants in the doodling group did shade into the shapes. There was one who didn't, and that person was replaced by someone else who did. So this little technique of trying to get the participants to doodle without actually telling them to doodle did kind of work. Control group, however, was not given any such instructions because they did not have these shapes on their sheets of paper. Now, this task of listening to this mock telephone call and noting down the names of the people attending is called a monitoring task. Okay, so you're actually writing down the names while listening to the call. So if you're in the doodling group, you're listening to this 2.5 minute call, you're shading into these shapes. The speaker takes the name of someone who is attending, and you write down the name on your sheet of paper, then you continue shading while listening to the call. They take another name, you try to pay attention and see if that person is attending or not attending. If they are attending, you write their name down as well on the sheet, and so on for 2.5 minutes. Control group does the exact same thing. The only difference is that they're just simply sitting and listening to the call without doodling. What if some of the control group participants naturally start doodling? That is a possibility, but that was not the case in this study. Okay, so this is called the monitoring task. So the monitoring task is essentially assessing your concentration. Okay, so it's a boring task because the call itself is not a very interesting call. You can actually find details about the entire call. The entire script is there online. I didn't include it in my slides because it's not very important. I will tell you some important details, however, about it. Um, it's about a very generic topic. It's not a generic topic. It's about a very random general topic where the speaker is talking about random things like some new furniture that she bought or some renovations that she made to her house or what she's planning on bringing or what others are planning on bringing to the party. So nothing specific, no real specific topic as such. And this is important because let's say she's talking about football and there are three participants who are really interested in football. So it's natural that these three participants would pay more attention to the call and they may remember information better from the call. So they would have an advantage over other participants. So for that reason, we're ensuring that the call, the contents of the call are purely neutral, no specific topic that may spark anyone's particular interest. And it is a rather dull and mundane topic that is being discussed. So nothing to keep you too interested. So that's why this is considered a very boring task. Okay, so the concentration is being assessed over here because you're listening to this call and you're writing down the names of the people who you hear are attending, either definitely or probably attending. So you just note those down. Now, each participant is going to get a monitoring performance score or a monitoring task score. So your concentration will be assessed by a numerical value, so it's being measured, and the formula is correct names written minus false alarms. You should know this formula. Correct names written. Now, I told you that there are certain names of people that will be taken who are attending. There are a total of 8 people who are attending the party. Okay, I don't remember all the names. I think there was one, there was Jane, there was Craig, um, I think there was a Susie, I'm not entirely sure. But there were 8 such names of people who are attending, and there are 3 names of people who are not attending. And there's also a cat named Ben that is mentioned. Um, just adding that for the sake of it, because that was the name that was mentioned, but it's the name of a cat. So again, if you, for example, write Ben as one of the names, then it's not a correct answer because Ben is not attending the party. So 8 names of people who are attending, and as a result, you can get a maximum score of 8 out of 8. If you write all 8 correct names, you get the maximum score of 8. False alarms refers to writing down names of people who are not attending. So if you've written, let's say, 7 correct names, you missed out one. So you've written 7 correct names, but you've also written down the name of someone who is not attending. So your score would be 7 minus 1, which would be 6 out of 8. So writing down names of people who are not attending is a false alarm. Just think of it as negative marking in a way. Let's say you've written all 8 correct names of people. So all 8 people who are attending, you've written all of those names. And you haven't written a single false alarm. So you would get the maximum score of 8 on 8. Let's say another example, you've written all 8 correct names, but you've also written names of 2 other people who are not attending. So your monitoring task score would be 8 minus 2, which is 6 on 8. Okay. If a question comes to which they're asking you, how is the monitoring task calculated? You need to write correct names written minus false alarms. A mistake students make is they simply write correct names minus false alarms. They don't write the word written. You have to use the full terms that are being mentioned over here, correct names written minus false alarms, because they're actually writing down names of the people who they hear in the call that they believe are attending the party. So false alarms refers to writing down names of people who were not attending. You have to write down names. You cannot write down terms. For example, if the speaker says, my sister Jane, it's her birthday. So Jane is obviously coming, but you need to write down the name Jane, not sister. Then if she says, my neighbors are coming, and then she takes the names of the neighbors, you need to write down their names, not the relationship that you have with the speaker. So neighbor or sister would be ignored. You have to write down the actual names of the people attending. Now, plausible mishearings were counted as correct. Plausible mishearings are basically, in a way, giving the benefit of the doubt to the participant, which means you misheard a name, but it's a name that is similar to the name of the person attending, so we will count it as correct. For example, one of the names of the people attending was Craig, but one participant misheard it as Greg and wrote down Greg. So we still counted it as correct. Okay, so if it's a name that matches or is similar to the actual name, then we will still count it as correct. That will be considered a plausible mishearing. So once this task was done and the monitoring task scores were calculated, the participants were then debriefed. They were debriefed because, if you remember, they were told that they are not required to remember anything. So they were slightly deceived about the memory task that is going to be conducted. So during a 1 minute debriefing, they were apologized to by Andrade. She said, we told you not required to remember anything. I apologize for that. The reason I did that was to avoid demand characteristics. But now we're moving on to the second phase of the procedure, which is called the recall task, where your memory is now going to be tested. So the first task, which is the monitoring task, is assessing your concentration, which is writing down the names while listening to the call. The recall task is now the part of the procedure where you have to try and remember the names of the people, but now you're not listening to the call. So you have to use your memory and try to remember the names that were taken by the speaker of the people who are attending the party. The recall task has 2 parts to it. The first part is pretty straightforward, where you're recalling the names of the 8 people who you heard. So as many names as you can remember who were coming or who were invited, who are definitely coming, you try to recall them. This is called recall of names or recall of monitored information. So you should know both of these terms. Recall of names, also referred to as recall of monitored information. The other part of the recall task is something unexpected. The recall task in a whole is unexpected, but the second part specifically of the recall task is something which is completely out of the blue, which is the participants are going to be asked to try and remember any of the 8 places that were mentioned in the call. Now, earlier on, I said that there were 8 places, 8 towns in the UK that were also mentioned in this call. For example, the speaker would say something like, my friend is coming from London to attend, or my friend is coming from, I don't remember, I think Birmingham was one of the towns or cities that were mentioned. I'm not entirely sure. But let's assume that I think one of them was Eli, ELY. So yeah, so and so, let's say Tony is traveling to Eli for the weekend, so they cannot make it. So just like that, there were 8 places in the UK that were also mentioned in this call. Now, nothing was specifically said about the places to them, to the participants. They were simply told that you have to focus on the names of the people attending and just write those down. So The participants in the recall task are also going to be asked to try and recall as many places as they can remember that were mentioned by the speaker in the call. And recall of places is also called recall of incidental information. Now, what is the purpose of recalling places? So, we are expecting, remember, the doodling participants to have a higher score in the monitoring task as well as the recall task compared to the control group, if doodling does indeed enhance concentration and memory. So if the doodling group is able to recall more, is able to write down more correct names than the control group, then they will naturally have a higher monitoring score than the control group. And in the recall of names, again, we're expecting the doodling group to recall more names than the control group. But recall of places is being done because we want to see if doodling does indeed help you concentrate to such an extent that you are able to remember information of the call that you've been told nothing about. You've only been told to remember, or not even remember, to write down and focus on the names of the people. So, okay, fine, you've written the names down, you still might remember them. But nothing was said to you about the places. So, was doodling able to enhance your concentration and memory to such a level that you focused on other information also that was not considered necessary? So, that is the purpose of the recall task for places. Now, the formula for calculating the recall task of names and places is the same as it was for the monitoring task. Recall of names is calculated by correct names recalled minus false alarms, and recall of places is correct places recalled minus false alarms. Okay. Again, you have to make sure you use the correct terminology. If you write correct names minus false alarms or correct places minus false alarms, you will not get full marks. You have to write correct places recalled minus false alarms and correct names recalled minus false alarms for the formula of the recall task for names and places. Another important point is for the recall of names, you have to use the same plausible mishearing that you wrote down. So, for example, the participant who wrote Greg instead of Craig, when they're recalling the names, they have to recall Greg. They can't recall it as Craig or anything else. So, they have to use the same mishearing that they wrote down. Okay, the two tasks of recalling names and places were counterbalanced. Now, counterbalancing is a process where we do two tasks, let's say task A and B, in the order A, B, and then B, A. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that we have 20 participants in the doodling group. We have 20 participants in the control group. Let's look at the 20 in the doodling group first. Half of these 20 participants, which is 10, during the recall task, 10 of these participants in the doodling group will be asked to recall the names first, and then they'll be asked to recall the places. Whereas the other half, the other 10 in the doodling group, will be asked to do the opposite. They'll be asked to recall places first, and then they'll be asked to recall the names. And same with the control group. The 20 participants in the control group, half of them will be asked to recall names first and then places. The other half will be asked to recall places first and then names. This process is called counterbalancing, and the purpose of counterbalancing is to avoid order effects. And the reason order effects would happen is maybe because the participants had just heard the voice, the tape, the audio tape, and they had written down the names. So maybe the names are fresh in their minds. So for that reason, we'll make half of the people recall the names first, then the places, and the other half recall the places first and the names then. So by doing so, we're ensuring that it is not the order of the task that is affecting their memory. So this process is called counterbalancing, and it improves the validity of the study. Some controls of the study: all participants took the same mock telephone call. It was played at 227 words per minute for 2.5 minutes. All participants in each respective group was given the same sheet of paper in the doodling group and the control group. Okay, what are the results now? So on average, for the doodling group, 36.3 shapes were doodled, and the range was 3 to 110. So the minimum number of shapes doodled by a participant was 3, and the maximum was 110. And on average, people in the doodling group shaped around 36 shapes. Now let's look at the score for the monitoring performance for both groups. So remember, the monitoring task or the monitoring performance was listening to the call and writing down the name. So assessing your concentration. The doodling group had a mean of 7.7 with one false alarm. One false alarm. So all 20 participants in the doodling group combined had just one single false alarm. And the average score that they got was 7.7 out of 8, which is pretty good. The mean number of correct names written, however, was 7.8. So what's the difference between the 7.8 and 7.7? Basically, what this is trying to say is the doodling group, on average, wrote 7.8 correct names. Now remember, just writing down the names is not enough for your monitoring score. You need to minus false alarms as well. So on average, 7.8 correct names were written, and there was only one false alarm. So when you minus the false alarm from the average number of correct names written, then the total monitoring score is 7.7. For the control group, however, they wrote a total, or sorry, an average of 7.1 correct names, and they had a total of 5 false alarms. So when we remove the 5 false alarms, when you minus the false alarms from their average 7.1 correct names written, then they get a total monitoring score of 6.9. So clearly these results show you that, and let me tell you the two which you should focus on the most. This one, 7.7 and 6.9. When we compare these two scores, we can clearly see that the doodling group was able to concentrate much better than the control group, which is why they had a higher monitoring performance score. They were able to write an average overall correct names on average much more than the control group. They had much fewer false alarms as well, which is why their overall monitoring performance score was 7.7, much better than that of the control group, 6.9. So immediately, one thing we can learn from this is that doodling does help you concentrate in a boring task, because those who didn't doodle did not perform as well. Now let's look at the results for the recall task. And again, like I said, recall is split into two, recall of names and recall of places. So the recall task for names was an average of 5.1 for the doodling group and 4.0 for the control group. Now, naturally, we are expecting the participants to have a lower recall task than the monitoring task because they were not told about the recall task. They were told about the monitoring task. But even within the recall task, we can clearly see that the doodling group has performed better than the control group. And when it comes to recall for places, again, the doodling group scored much better than the control group, although both had a very low score. And this is understandable because nothing was specifically said to them about the places in terms of the task, in terms of having to remember anything about the places. So the doodling group scored an average of 2.4, whereas the control group had an average of 1.8. So the overall recall task score, if you want to combine names and places, would be 5.1 and 2.4 for the doodling group, which is 7.5. And for the control group, it would be 4.0, which was the recall score for names, and 1.8 for places, so a total of 5.8. So recall task score overall for doodling is 7.5 and for control is 5.8. So in both the tasks, doodling and monitoring, you can clearly see that, sorry, not doodling, the recall and monitoring, the doodling group has performed better than the control group. Now, something interesting here is that there were 7 participants, 3 from the doodling and 4 from control, who actually did say that we suspected a memory task. So remember the time where they were being debriefed for 1 minute right after the monitoring task, where Andrade apologized to them for not telling them that there would be a recall task? During that period, there were 7 participants who actually admitted to suspecting a memory task. And they said that they did make an effort to try and remember the information. So this is a little bit of qualitative data because they're admitting themselves that they did suspect a memory task and they did perhaps show demand characteristics. So this is something that could lower the validity of the study. So because both tasks, the doodling, not the doodling, the monitoring task and the recall task, we saw that the doodling group performed much better than the control group. We can conclude that doodling does aid both concentration and memory during a boring task. It's a pretty straightforward conclusion. Now, in terms of the nature-nurture debate, um, there could be an element of nature because a person's memory could be due to biological factors. Maybe some people are just naturally more intelligent or have better memory, better concentration levels, maybe due to genetic factors, which could play a role in why they were able to remember better than other participants. However, there's also an element of nurture because the way that participants doodled, although yes, they had to shade into the shapes, but some people may have shaded differently. Might have shaded with more concentration than others. So the way that people shade, the way that people tend to learn or remember things or concentrate could be affected by environmental factors, could be affected by how you learn things from your environment. So that could have played a potential role in why some participants may have scored better than others. For the individual situational debate, it's favoring the situational side because the participants who were in the doodling situation overall performed much better than those who were in the control situation. However, the individual explanation can also be supported because um, the way that the participants or the number of shapes that they doodle was different. Some people doodle a lot, many more shapes than others. Remember the range 3 to 110. So those who doodled more may have concentrated better, may have remembered information better, whereas those who doodle less perhaps may not have gotten as high a score as the other fellow doodling members in their group. So the number of shapes, the way they doodled, all of these factors were different from the 20 participants, were different among the 20 participants in the doodling group, which could have also affected their results. So these would be potential participant variables. Another point which you could also mention is that some people just may generally have better memory than others. So that could also be a reason why some people may have performed better. So that would also be a point that could favor the individual explanation. But moving to the application, and this is a question that they love asking about the Andrade study. They love asking applications of this study. And you should know two. One is that students can use this information during boring lectures and classrooms. They can doodle to enhance their memory, enhance their concentration, to help them recall information better for tests. And even employees during important meetings at organizations, if they're supposed to, if they're required to write down any key information, target information, um, while the meeting is happening, they can doodle, which might enhance their concentration and help them note down key information better. Evaluation now. So lab experiment strength is that reliability is high because there are many controls. We discussed some of the controls. You should give examples of one or two, and then you can go on to say that this makes the procedure standardized and easy to replicate for reliability. Validity is a strength because, like we discussed, the recall task was counterbalanced to avoid order effects. The call itself was very mundane and not on any particular topic. It was on a neutral topic to avoid anyone's specific interests. Um, Weakness, however, is it was an independent measures design. So, as I mentioned earlier, there could have been individual differences. There could have been participant variables, for example, because they're randomly allocated to one of the two groups. What if you randomly allocated people who have better memory to the doodling group? What if overall there were a larger number of people in the doodling group who just generally had better memory? So it may not be down to the doodling, but instead down to their memory, their natural ability to concentrate and remember information better than others, which could be the reason why they had a higher score. So that could lower the validity. It's a potential participant variable or individual difference. Generalizability is a weakness. Only 40 participants, very small representation of males. They're all from the same psychology panel, so they may have certain similarities. So we cannot represent, well, the sample does not represent a larger population, so the findings cannot be applied a larger group, to a larger group of males, or even people of other cultures. Ecological validity is also a weakness as it's an artificial setting of a lab, and in everyday life, it's not common for people to be listening to a fake telephone call and they're not required to write down information from it. So it's not a task that you expect to do in everyday life. So not something that you can easily generalize to everyday life situations. So mundane realism and ecological validity is also a weakness. Ethics is a bit of a strength and weakness both. There is consent. They were paid for their participation. They were debriefed eventually, and the identities were kept confidential. However, there was slight deception because they were not told about the recall task. And you can even argue that there might have been some psychological harm as the participants were already tired from completing another study and we're making them go through a really boring task. So by creating boredom in them, we may have been causing some emotional or psychological harm to them. Quantitative data is a strength. It's objective and numerical. The results on the monitoring task and the recall tasks were analyzed to compare the two groups. And through that, we were able to determine that doodling does indeed enhance your memory and concentration during a boring task. So we're done with this study, and I will be back with more videos. So if anyone has any questions about this, please feel free to message me. Um, there will be a link for a WhatsApp group that I've created. So if you wish, you can join. There'll be regular updates, and I'll be sharing notes on that group as well. So see you next time. Take care.